The quote-unquote God of War formula of action games is something that a lot of different franchises have used, and every platform has at least one or two of those games, so everyone in the gaming world can experience it. There's Devil May Cry, Bayonetta, and what a close friend refers to as God of War with Christian background, Darksiders. Until about a week ago, only half of these franchises were available on handhelds, God of War and Bayonetta, but Darksiders makes its handheld debut on the Switch in a really nice way. Without further ado, here is my review of Darksiders Warmastered Edition for the Nintendo Switch. In the world of Darksiders, the armies of heaven and hell are at peace awaiting the apocalypse under the watchful eye of the Charred Council and their special task force, the Four Horsemen. However, that peace is broken when the apocalypse is falsely started, and the horseman of the apocalypse known as War is summoned to Earth, unaware that his call was a false one. For unknowingly breaking the balance of peace, he is punished by the Charred Council and tasked with hunting down who tried to start the apocalypse in order to eliminate them and re-maintain that balance. There's one thing I really like about the story of Darksiders. It takes its source material, a lot of the mythos around the Christian religion, and makes its own story out of it, changing up a lot of stuff and making up their own stuff. Especially when you compare it to games like the Dante's Inferno game, which was also Christian based, but didn't deviate that much from the source material. But here we've got a bunch of lore that you don't already know just from researching Christian mythology, not to mention the exceptional voice cast performing in this game, from Liam O'Brien as War to Mark Hamill as his little sidekick doing his Joker voice from Batman the Animated Series. When it comes to gameplay, Darksiders is a 3D action game with a lot of platforming and puzzle elements thrown into the mix. If you know the God of War formula, you pretty much know how you play this game. Slash your way through enemies, platform around, and solve puzzles to open up new paths and eventually find a boss. Do you know that this is Warmastered Edition, the remaster, not the original game? As such, there are a lot of graphical enhancements in this version that you didn't have on the PS3 and 360. There's also a small change in content where you can buy the Harvester Scythe without inputting a special code, but overall it's pretty much the same content. As I mentioned earlier, progress is pretty linear, though you do have fast travel that you can use to go back to previous areas. The game still pushes you towards the same areas in the story, but you can go back if you really want to revisit those areas, go to a shop, or just grind for money. But outside of backtracking, your goal is always to get to the next main dungeon, navigate through it, and find its boss. The actual navigation of dungeons really uses a lot of the God of War formula, so much so that early on in the game it felt like there wasn't really very much difference between God of War and Darksiders. You have to do a lot of platforming, you have some pretty simple puzzles that require you to move blocks around, and you've got hordes of enemies in a lot of rooms that lock you in, until you take out those enemies in button mash heavy combat. Thankfully, despite the similarities, the further I got in the game, the more unique things started to come out. Now the combat system is very similar. It's very button mashy with its combos. You can hold a button to launch people into the air and do air combos, and you've got quick time events for gore deaths of pretty much every normal and boss enemy you find. But things start to look a little bit different and more unique when you get to your transformation, where you become a giant demon-like thing that can attack enemies in huge AoE attacks, along with some of the smaller systems like having little passive skills and elemental attacks you can apply to your weapons, and gathering key items that help you in each dungeon. And the latter of those points, key items, is what makes Darksiders feel like it has just a little hint of Zelda in its formula. Every dungeon has a special tool that you get that helps you solve puzzles in those dungeons, take down that dungeon's boss, but can also be used as a weapon against enemies. For example, the first dungeon gives you a huge ninja star that you can throw to light torches, but can also be used to attack flying enemies. And the second dungeon gives you a special gauntlet that lets you smash barriers that are blocking your path. Every one of these is built around a certain amount of platforming and exploration, but also to dramatically increase your arsenal past just your main weapon and the sub-weapons you can buy from the shop. Now, all of this does come together with a very God of War-like experience, but what I just mentioned makes it different enough that the farther you get in the game, the less it feels like a clone and the more it feels like its own thing. And content and length is also something that's a little different. Most of the God of War games aren't really that lengthy, and that goes for a lot of games of this formula in general. Most of them come down to maybe 8 to 12 hours for its story campaign. Darksiders' story campaign will take you at least 15 to 20 hours. Much longer than I was expecting this game to last. Now let's dive into presentation, which has a lot of variety to it. Graphically, Darksiders has two different game modes, quality mode and performance mode. If you put the game in quality mode, you have a higher resolution but a much lower frame rate and a lot more frame drops. Put it into performance mode and the frame rate skyrockets to what looks like around 60 frames per second with a little bit of blurriness from the dropped resolution. And when I say just a little bit of blurriness, I mean just a very slight amount of it. To be perfectly honest, outside of a few jagged edges in the environment, I can't really tell much of a difference between quality and performance mode. The latter looks so good and plays so well that I never went back to it outside of comparisons for this review. But performance mode isn't perfect. There are still occasional small frame drops when you're wandering around environments, and some of the areas have to stop to load as you're going through if you run through them too fast. Now let's get into battery life, which is pretty standard. Darksiders has a battery range of 2 hours and 30 minutes on high settings, up to 3 hours and 3 minutes on low settings. Now in conclusion, Darksiders 1 comes to the Switch and the handheld community in general, with fun gameplay and a lot of graphical options for the people who would rather play it at a higher resolution and for the people who would rather have a higher frame rate. Now the downside, this port isn't perfect, with a few frame drops here and there and some loading issues, but if you can look past a few frame drops, you're going to get a lengthy and fun action platformer to go along with Bayonetta and Bayonetta 2. Reviews to Go rates Darksiders Warmastered Edition for the Nintendo Switch a 9 out of 10. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Thanks for watching and have a great day.